Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with Malcolm Foley. Dr. Foley is a pastor, historian, and speaker who serves as special advisor to the president of Baylor University with a focus on equity and campus engagement. He's written for Christianity Today, The Anxious Bench, and Mere Orthodoxy. Malcolm co-pastors Mosaic Waco, a multicultural church in Waco, Texas, where he lives with his wife, Desiree. Malcolm is the author of a new book titled The Anti-Greed Gospel, Why the Love of Money is the Root of Racism. All right. And how the church can create a new way forward. Dr. Foley holds a BA in religious studies with a second major in finance and a minor in classics from Washington University in St. Louis. He then completed an MDiv at Yale Divinity School and a PhD in religion at Baylor. He's also the former director of Black Church Studies at George W. Truett Theological Seminary. And you can learn more about Malcolm and all of his work at mosaicwaco.org. So, Malcolm, congratulations on all your work. It's a pleasure to meet you, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's good to meet you too.
So, first of all, is there anything else you'd like people to know about you?
That introduction covers most of it. It's very much a dream. It's very much a dream come true to write this book. To have an opportunity to, as I'll say in other contexts, as an opportunity to go after the eyes and the heart of a demon rather than its
Mm.
extremities. But yeah, no, I'm excited. I'm excited for our conversation.
So, before we get into the book, could you perhaps tell folks a little bit more about your work at Mosaic and at
Sure.
Baylor?
Sure. So we planted this church 6 years ago, and initially planted in the PCA, but actually left that denomination about a year and a half or so into our life. So we're a non-denominational church right now, but it's that church kind of inspires a lot of the work that I do. We did over the course of the past year. So we did a sermon series through the Sermon on the Mount in 11 months. And it was just an opportunity to just hear the words of Jesus, and then for me to encourage the people of God to just live in that way, and experience the joy and power that comes out of that. And then we moved immediately into preaching through Revelation, which we're in the middle of right now. So it's a great time. It's a great time. With Baylor, I work with the other vice presidents of the institution, but especially thinking through issues of diversity and equity, which is something that is, it's a fraught place to be, especially now in our current political milieu. So it's been a blessing to be able to work with the institution, especially at such a difficult time as this.
Yes, absolutely. I can totally understand that. Well, so let's talk about the book. As I
All right.
said, the title is The Anti-Greed Gospel, Why the Love of Money is the Root of Racism and How Church Can Create a New Way Forward. So can you tell everyone how this book came about?
Sure. So Brazos initially approached me wanting a book on racial violence in the church because I'm a
Mm,
historian of lynching,
mm,
specifically how Black Protestant churches responded to lynching in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so as I was thinking about what I wanted to communicate in a book about racial violence and the church, and as I encountered, there was a month. It was February 2022, and I was preparing a talk on Martin Luther King's legacy. So I revisited Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, his last book. But then that same month, I read Jonathan Tran's Asian Americans and the Spirit of Racial Capitalism, and what became my favorite book of Christian theology, which is Antonio Gonzalez's God's Reign and the End of Empires. I read
mm,
all of those books over the course of a
mm,
month, and then
mm.
and realized, actually, this is my theology now. But integral to that was King's claim, especially in the last few years of his life, that we're dealing with triple evils: racism, militarism, and materialism, and you can't deal with one without dealing with all three. And this harkens back to not only his work in the civil rights movement, but the work of others like Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph, and others who were deeply convinced that that racial justice can't be conceived of apart from economic justice. And and as I brought particularly my historical work in there, it became very clear to me that the history of race and racism is fundamentally a history of greed, which means that if we as Christians are going to seek to build anti-racist communities, we have to build anti-greed ones. And that
Yes.
and that also then was brought home to me in rethinking about Christ's words in Matthew 6:24, where he says we can't serve two masters. You'll either love one and hate the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You can't serve both God and there could have been, he could have chosen a number of different other masters, but he chooses mammon, or the Aramaic word for riches. And so that led me to want to write a book where essentially the claim is that when we look at particularly America's history of race and racism, what we're looking at is a proxy war of a cosmic battle, and that cosmic battle is waged between God and Mammon for our souls.
Really? Wow. Well, good for you. I mean, I have to look at those two books. I know you referred to Jonathan Tran,
Hmm.
in your book, but I need to check out those two books. They sound like they're pretty
Oh
impactful.
yeah, they're great. They're great.
So, I was first attracted to your book by the title,
Hmm.
which, points to greed as the underlying issue, as you said, which is something I also believe, but I think gets less attention than what it deserves.
Hmm.
Why do you think that's been the case?
Oh, I mean, I think we find ourselves in a political economy that has largely baptized the desire to get rich. And we don't like to read when Paul says in 1 Timothy 6, he doesn't just say that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. He says that, but immediately before that, he says those who desire to get rich fall into a trap and a snare and all these kinds of things. Which and that is not something that we want to hear in a society that basically encourages. I mean, I look through Instagram reels and stuff, and just constantly bombarded with numerous ways that I can make more money. And that's just normal. And it is and that context in 1 Timothy 6 is talking about contentment. And that is not something that we are encouraged to pursue in a system of neoliberal capitalism. The goal is you can get rich, go ahead and do it. Forget about the ways in which you're gonna be exploiting your neighbor, particularly the poor. As long as you can get yours, it's fine. And that's an assumption that's not only, I think it's not only prevalent nationally, but it's bled into church settings as well. I ask folks whether or not they've heard preaching on greed, and the answer and people experience that don't experience that very often, which is confusing to me because Jesus talks about it a lot.
Yeah,
And I
exactly.
mean, it's throughout the Old and the New Testament. To go back to that First Timothy 6 text, we're told immediately after he says the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. He says, "Man of God, flee from these things." We're told to flee from two things. We're told to flee from sexual sin, and we're also told to flee from greed. And most of our communities are not being taught to flee from greed.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and so yeah, that was another kind of impetus for this book. I wanted to not only name it, but also reveal it for the insidious evil that it
Yeah.
is.
Well, I mean, I think your point that it's so ingrained, in our
Mhm.
society is really the gist of it, which, makes solving the problem just incredibly difficult.
Yeah, 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 it's true.
It's kind of like we thought solving racism was bad enough, right? Now,
Yeah,
okay, well, really, that's just a symptom of a deeper issue, a broader issue, a more ingrained
yep,
issue.
yep.
Oh my gosh. Anyway, in the book, you dive deeper into greed as a three-pronged feedback loop of self-interest.
Hmm. Hmm.
One is using others for personal gain. Two is violently protecting that gain. Three is creating ideas such as racism to justify the exploitation of others. So
Yeah.
you tell your audience about kind of how you came about with that construct and
Yeah.
more about it.
Yeah, it's in many ways it's a re-narration of King's Triple Evils, and a similar feedback loop that actually Jonathan Tran names. One of the elements that I want to add is that uh, is its demonic nature. Like this is something that is not only kind of perpetuated by human ingenuity, but we have help too. So it begins with our desire to exploit and dominate each other. So we power the desire for power and money. And often that's going to require me to interact with you in a way that allows me to exert power over you or to somehow take money from you. But the thing is, like most people don't like being exploited or dominated. So people employ violence to keep them in that position. But most of us also have consciences, so we don't wake up in the morning and think I'm really excited for a day of dominating, exploiting, and killing my neighbor. So we create narratives in order to tell ourselves that that's not what we're doing to each other. And so then we have this cycle of exploitation, violence, and lies. Exploitation, violence, and lies. One of the easiest examples of this is racialized chattel slavery. So when the Portuguese come to Africa, witness chattel slavery, they don't get involved because they're racist. They get involved because they have markets they want to expand. And this is a really cheap source of labor. As they have to justify that wealth to themselves and to the Pope, that's when the language of blackness and whiteness enters into the lexicon. It's they're black, so they're savages that need to be civilized. They're heathens that need to be Christianized. Yes, we're making a whole bunch of money. Just ignore that. Ignore that. This is really a noble pursuit on our part. But it continues to be a way of hiding that cycle of exploitation, violence, and lies. Exploitation, violence, and lies. And so I wanted to not only name that cycle, but to also encourage Christian communities to think about what it means to break that cycle at each of those points. That we're not just talking about the way that we think about each other, or the things that we say to each other, but we've got to think about what are the kinds of material commitments that are going to be necessary for us to break this cycle.
Mhm. So another thing you talk about in the book are the bad aspects of both capitalism and communism.
Yeah.
You speak of a need for what you call economic solidarity. Can you
hmm
explain what you mean by that?
Yeah. So, the tendency, especially to write an anti-capitalist book, the response is going to be, the accusation of being a communist. And one of the things I say in the book is like, look, I'm not aiming for a state. I'm not aiming for a state-run economy. What I want is for us to build an economic state of affairs that actually meets human need rather than catering to human greed. And so when I narrate economic solidarity, that's what I want to narrate as the opposite of greed. So when most people think about the opposite of greed, they're often going to think about generosity. And one of the points I want to make is that generosity can also very easily turn into paternalism, where you're the giver, the other person is the receiver, and you can give to them, they go on their way, you go on your way, you think really well of yourself, and that's the end of the story. But that's not the way that Christ gave. That's not the way that Christ gives to us. When the Son of God took on flesh, he did so in order to bring us up to where he is. It was an act of it was an act of solidarity for the purpose of uplift. That he became one of us and never stopped being one of us after that move. Our flesh, there's a sense in which our flesh sits on the throne of heaven, even now. And so when I think about what it means to build communities of economic solidarity, I think about 2 Corinthians 8, when Paul's talking to Corinth about the church in Macedonia that's made a request, and he says that his goal is equality. His goal is that you recognize that Corinth has things that Macedonia needs. Macedonia has things that Corinth needs, and what equality is that constant exchange. And so when I think about what it looks like to build relationships of economic solidarity, it means that well, the real example is what we see in Acts 4, when we're told that the grace of God was so powerfully at work among the people of God that there were no needy people in their midst. And that's not because they kicked the needy out. It's because when the needy entered into this community, the community gathered around them to meet their need. That's a concrete example of that solidarity, but that is the precise antidote to greed is a recognition that all of the resources that you've been given have been given to you, but for the purpose of sharing. We're told by our economy that we're fundamentally meant to be producers and consumers. And what the gospel reminds us of is the fact that we are to be fundamentally sharers.
Mm, mm. Well, I like the comment that you made about the focus on need as opposed to the focus on greed.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds like that could be a book right there. If you
Book
are looking for a new
two.
idea.
Book two.
Good, good, good. So you also advocate for a different type of philanthropy that you call divine philanthropy. Can you share your vision for that?
Yeah, so it goes back to what I was saying about the incarnation. So when we think about philanthropy, the word philanthropy just means love of humanity. But often when we think about philanthropy, we think about like billionaires giving a bunch of money to causes that are valuable to them. And the way and the model that I want to offer to folks is not the Carnegie Rockefeller kind of thing, but it's specifically the incarnation, that God expresses His love for His people by taking on flesh, but not just that. So I think about it Philippians 2, that hymn, we often understand it as being about humility and pride, and I want to reframe that in thinking about actually the difference between the difference between sharing and hoarding. We're told that Christ, though he was in the form of God, didn't see equality with God as a thing to be selfishly held on to, but instead took on the form of a servant. Well, what we're also being told there is that he had all things, all fame, power, all those kinds of things, and he chose not to just hold on to those things for himself, but instead to share them with his brothers and sisters. That's why he takes on flesh. And my favorite picture of this is actually at the end of Revelation 3, in Jesus' last words to the church in Laodicea, because this is a church that it's lukewarm because it's rich. And at the end, this promise that he makes to them is, he says, to the one who overcomes, I will give to them to sit with me on my throne, just as I overcame and sat with my Father on his throne.
Hmm.
Which is to say that the promise that Christ lays out to these people is, look, stop focusing on all this glittery stuff, because what I have for you is not just, and at the end of Revelation and in Daniel, we're told that the saints will reign with Christ together, or in the new heavens and new earth. And you could think that just means that, like, well, we're going to have like little thrones next to Jesus, and it's going to be great, and we're going to hang out forever. But what he says is like, no, like, you get to sit with me, like on my throne, the one that I share with the Father. And we'll be able to, and that like, even I am not only I am sharing even my reign with you. And that's the root of suffering leads to that end. And one of the things he's saying is like, look, don't settle for all that other stuff. And so for that to be the model of divine philanthropy, that it's fundamentally through a lens of sharing rather than just a kind of giving from afar, that's the kind of paradigm that I want to call the church back into.
Wow, cool. So another statement you make in the book is that it would be unfair to expect righteousness from those who are not united to Christ,
Hmm.
but it's entirely fair to expect it from the church.
Hmm.
Well, first of all, why do you think it's fair to let non-Christians off the hook
Yeah,
on
yeah,
this?
yeah, yeah. Well, so one of the things that I well, so the three things that I call folks to over the course of the latter half of the book, call them: the deep economic solidarity, creative anti-violence, and prophetic truth-telling. Now, all of those things I would hope would be attractive to people, both Christian and non-Christian. Um, but I think that the only way to have the kind of stamina necessary to not only battle kind of the earthly battle that this is, but also the cosmic battle that it is, you're gonna run up against some obstacles that a lot of people don't have the resources to fight. And despair and disillusionment are they're very, very powerful. But I deeply believe that Christ has given his people the resources to actually be able to continually engage in this fight. So I want to partner with everyone, everyone who sees that everyone who sees these issues and sees that this is the way to solve them, I want to partner with all of you. But I also want to be clear about the fact that like even when you get discouraged, I'm going to keep going because I have to, because this is the way, because this is work that I believe that Christ has done, is doing, and will finish. And so this is one of what ought to be one of the elements of the witness of the church, is specifically is specifically a perseverance, even in the midst of seemingly insurmountable odds, even understanding that we might die, like we might actually die in this fight. That neither stops nor slows us down, because we serve a Savior who died before us, and we're people who claim to be baptized with him in his death. And if that's true, then we're also a people who believe that we'll share with him in his resurrection. And so I don't want to let anybody off the hook, but I do want people to enter into this work with sober expectations.
So my second part of the question, maybe you already answered it, but the church is not in great shape, right?
I
I mean,
know, I know.
it's obviously been shrinking for decades.
Yeah.
And, one could argue that a lot of the church really doesn't really reflect what Jesus
Hmm.
said we should do.
Hmm.
So why in the world are we going to rely on that institution to do
Yeah.
anything? I mean, that's the question it raises in my mind, just from a pragmatic
Hmm.
standpoint.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, even the three things that I call us to, the context in which I want to say that is like this is actually this is basic Christian ethics, really.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So and so this is something that, but I think it begins. I mean, it's just going to begin in smaller. It's going to begin in smaller communities. It's going to begin with these small communities that can then show their neighborhoods, hey, look, this is another way. This is another way to live, and it's actually a more joyful and peaceful way to live too. And that also becomes a witness to even the broader church that's placed its faith in all kinds of other things, whether political power or money or whatever. I want this book to be a little bit of leaven in the hearts of folks to start asking these kinds of questions of their communities, but also to seek to creatively think about ways to actually just do these things that I think are just basic elements of Christian ethics. But yeah, I mean, it is hard in both a society and a church that in many ways refuses to reckon with greed. But I still think it's necessary. I think it's important for those who claim to be Christian to hear Jesus's words and then seek to actually do those things.
What a concept.
I know, right?
Crazy world we live in. Um, so what would you most like readers to take away from the book?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the main thing is what I think what God has prepared for them. So what I think Mammon has done, it has it's diluted our taste for the Lord. There are joys, there is power, there is peace that comes in union with Christ that far surpasses anything else that we could ever experience. And I think one of the primary obstacles to that experience is our greed. We're just not encouraged to think in those terms. There are kind of veils that have been put in front of us, that keep us from seeing that cosmic battle. And so one of the things that I hope to do, so I hope to reveal that. I also hope to deepen our conversations about race and racism, because they still tend to be, even insofar as they become conversations about the systemic and things like that, which is good. I mean, I want us to understand that it's not just an individual affair. We're also dealing with broader systems. But I also don't think that picture is dark enough. um, because we're dealing with because I deeply believe our struggle is not with flesh and blood, but with powers and principalities and spiritual forces of darkness in the heavenly places. And so I want people to see that in all of its darkness, but I also want them to understand that the light of Christ is bright enough to shine in the midst of any darkness.
Mm,
And I want them to be able to, and I want the church to recognize that that it has been given the resources to be an alternative social, economic, and political community, and that it can be an invitation to the world. And there is like I said, there is so much, but there's so much untapped potential there that lies at the
dude,
that
absolutely.
lies at the very tip of our fingers, that we refuse to take advantage of because we're distracted by this other stuff. And so I want to kind of just tear those distractions from our hands, basically.
Mm, mm, amen. So I want to switch gears just for a minute and talk about,
Yeah.
there's another platform I lead called Find Your Next Calling,
Yeah.
where we talk about kind of being called in a new direction. And you've
Hmm.
clearly done that. In the book, you mentioned that until your undergrad years, you were most interested in math, science,
Hmm.
and computer science, which is similar to myself. And now, of course, you're a pastor and an author.
Yeah.
So what led to that relatively monumental change in calling.
Yeah, I mean, and there was even when I was a teenager, I was teaching like these kids Sunday school class at church, and there was a woman at my church who would call me bishop, and I was like that's interesting. I don't know what that means, but okay. But I took a comparative religion class in 10th grade, which I think first got me into church history and theology. Um, but when I started undergrad, I mean, I knew I wanted to do a religious studies major, but my dad was like, you should do something a little more practical and marketable. So I threw finance in there, because why not? And I was and in between my junior and senior year of college, I interviewed for investment banking firms, but realized over the course of that process, I was like, I don't think I actually want to do this. And so I applied to seminaries. I applied to seminaries instead. But I did not foresee that, like, decade and a half down the line when I would write a book like this, that all of those interests would come together in one project. So none of it. So as I look back on it, like, I mean, none of that was a waste. I didn't know how it would all work together. But as time has gone on, I've seen the way that the Lord has kind of woven all of those things together to make me kind of who I am today. And so I'm thankful for each of those steps because I can use all of that in all of the spaces that I find myself in, which is a profound blessing in and of itself. And one that I'm thankful for, that one that I'm regularly thankful for.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, having, diversity in education and background is a
Yeah.
good idea, just like diversity in other
Yeah,
ways too, right?
exactly. Exactly.
So, what advice do you have for people who are thinking about becoming an author?
Yeah. So, and this is also what was, I think, most helpful in writing the dissertation, which was, I needed to find um, something that would, like a topic that would sustain me through what is a grueling process of kind
Mm,
of writing a project like this. Because there are days when you're not going to want to write. There are just days when the words don't come, all of that kind of stuff. But if you have something that really kind of really burns in you, in the way that my dissertation in the way that my dissertation topic did, but also this book, and if you set habits of especially regularly writing, that's in many ways the only way that it gets done. That consistency. I mean, we're people of habit, and we're shaped by our habits. And that kind of discipline is I think really necessary to actually crank out a book. But but yeah, and there are maybe discouraging moments along the way, but that's also one of the reasons why those habits are really important because it just becomes just part of the rhythm of life. And that's how this stuff gets done. But like I said, I mean, it was a dream come true to be able to write something like this, and I'm excited to get it into people's hands.
Well, I think the point that you made about, it has to be something you're really passionate about is really important because, that's what I've seen in the authors that have been, successful. And
Yeah,
it's successful meaning just getting books out, I mean,
yeah,
not
yeah,
necessarily sales numbers, but um, having that passion, and that drive is what gets you through the perseverance that you need to have, and the
yeah,
patience and the time commitment. So,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, good for you.
Oh, thank you.
So, I realize you just launched a book, but, can you talk about anything in the future, whether it's
Oh man.
books or other kinds of projects that you're able to at least talk about at this point?
Yeah, I'm thinking about it. I want to see what makes people the most upset about this book, and then I'll turn that into another book.
Oh,
So
good, good. I like that strategy.
But yeah, I mean, it's actually something that I ask, when I do podcasts with folks, I ask them, after you've read it, what do you think a good follow-up would look like? Because I'm thinking through especially um, as I care for my own church, and try to work these things out like in an actual community. The effects of that, some of the practical things that come out of that context. That could be a follow-up. But I'm still thinking about it. We'll see where this goes. I mean, this book was a product of kind of my development over the course of a number of years. As the Lord continues to do that work in me, we'll see what other books might come.
Well, I think you already have my vote. This focus on, need versus greed,
Need versus
and
greed. Yeah.
kind of exploring practical aspects of what that means.
Yeah.
How do we live that?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
that's what I'd love to see, just personally.
Well, yeah. Well, hey, I'll put it on the list.
Well, Malcolm, thanks so much for joining us, and many congratulations on this book, and taking the work and effort and the courage, to lay it out as you have. So, thank you very much for that.
Thank you,
Uh,
Brian.
Again, the title of Malcolm's book is The Anti-Greed Gospel: Why the Love of Money is the Root of Racism and How the Church Can Create a New Way Forward. It's an excellent book. I encourage everyone to check it out. And you can learn more about all of Malcolm's work at mosaicwaco.org. Malcolm, thank you again, and many blessings.
Thank you. Thank you.